Okay, welcome to the final of the 3 lectures for Chapter 5 on understanding conflict, talking about the nature and causes of war. This lecture is going to specifically focus on why wars begin. What are the main reasons behind why most conflict starts? Our major objective today is to assess the causes of both interstate and intrastate war. And this needs to be noted that as we talk about war in this section, we're talking about war in all aspects. We're not talking about making a lot of differences between civil wars and interstate wars until the very end of the section. So for the most part, we're talking about all forms of war as we know it. Okay. The first things up, let's talk about the causes of war. There are 7 major factors that a theorist, and the theorist is K.J. Holste, has gone throughout and detected as leading to conflict. Okay, we can usually trace every major conflict over the course of the last 300 years back to one of these 7. Okay, the first one is territory. Either you have 2 countries that are disputing whether or not one area is in ownership of that territory, or you have one country who is wishing to acquire new territory and does so at the expense of another country, such as with the simulation we're doing in class, talking about Venezuela and Guyana, such as with the Iraq invasion of Kuwait in the 1990s for the Gulf War. We're talking about access to resources. These are going to become more prevalent as certain resources start to evaporate in the coming years. Look, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, for food and for water to be the cause in coming years. Second major reason is nation-state creation. For the last 100 years, we've had loads of groups of people who've wanted to seek and have their own state, their own drive, or their own territory. If you take a look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has now gone on for, well, in reality gone on for 60 years, but much longer than that in the region, the Palestinians are now in the mode of they are searching for statehood. They're trying to find an area that they can call their own. And so a lot of the Middle East peace process is toward trying to find Palestinians a state solution of their own. This is another cause of war. For most of the 20th century, ideology was a major cause. You look at fascism and communism, basically the leading causes of all wars from 1935 onward, especially until about 1989. Either fascism or communism dealt a serious portion in why a war started. Economics, and this leads also back to territory. This is the idea of people competing for resources, especially oil, water, food, things that we generate as a necessary resource. You're going to see this take place. Human sympathy is the 5th of our reasons. People trying to stop a conflict as a humanitarian action. If you look at Kosovo, if you look at the actions of the UN, or not the UN, excuse me, NATO and the United States in bombing Kosovo and trying to bring Slobodan Milosevic out of power in the 1990s, this was a major reason for conflict. Predation and survival, number 6. Just pure hatred for another group. You want them to be eliminated. You want their territory or their identity. You want them out of the picture. This is going to be a leading cause as well. The other factors, as far as Holste is concerned, really are an issue of maintaining alliances or maintaining balances of power in case one group gets too far ahead or too far behind. Again, not as frequent, we're talking about the 7th, but really territory, nation-state creation, ideology were especially important in the 20th century. It's very likely that economics and human sympathy will become more prevalent in 21st century war. So let's take a look at the patterns, and to do this we're going to break it down by levels. We've talked about the levels before: system level, state level, and individual level. We're going to do that once more here. Start with talking about system level explanations. The explanations from a system level always seem to come back to the structural characteristics that we talked about at the very beginning of the course. Anarchy, diversity, complexity. The more anarchical, the more diverse, or the more complex the situation, the more likely it leads to conflict. Another big explanation can be the distribution of power. How many countries have the power in a situation? Are we talking about a unipolar world where many people consider the United States to be a sole superpower? Are we talking about a bipolar world, such as we saw in the Cold War? Therefore, you have the U.S. and the Soviet Union coming on multiple sides. Or do we live in a multipolar world, such as the one many people would say we live in today? Does that have an impact? And does that cause there to be, especially when we're changing from bipolar to unipolar to multipolar, does this lead to wars beginning? That's one explanation from the system level. Another one is the use of the power transition theory, and this goes back to distribution of power. The idea that when there's a change in power distribution, this will lead to a lot of smaller wars. And if you go back to last section, we talked about the era of civil wars from 1989 to 2001. We were adjusting. We were moving from a very bipolar world to a very unipolar world. And as a result, all these conflicts that were kind of held in place by either the Soviet Union or the United States contributing a lot to that country, a lot of those conflicts, without there being an opposing force to kind of dictate, flared right back up. And suddenly you had a lot of these smaller civil wars dotting a lot of developing countries after 1989. Another one is the idea of the cyclical theory of war, which says that stability will exist when, at the end of a major conflict like the end of World War II, you have those victors, the US, UK, France, Russia, China, they all assert their dominance on the world. And as they continue to assert their dominance, when war does arise, it's when somebody arises to challenge that dominance. And we didn't see it as much immediately after World War II. We didn't really start to see it as much until now. Now we're seeing people who are rising, or countries that are rising up against the U.S., against China, to say, no, we don't agree with you having this necessary power. And so you'll start to see war kind of accelerate when people are challenging the dominance of one or multiple countries who are in power. Then we take a look at some of the alternative theories. Interdependence, as we've talked about. For liberals, this is a reason why war has been prevented more often in modern times. The idea that you don't shoot your customers. And we'll talk more about that here in a second. But the idea that interdependence is going to lead to less conflict. Okay? The last is the feminist theory, which we discussed in Chapter 4. The idea that if more women were in power, we'd have less conflict. And there's a lot of people that would say, yes, that would occur. Again, though we haven't had any anecdotal evidence to the contrary. And we've also seen the last major female world leader, Margaret Thatcher, was one who led the United Kingdom into war. Led them into war with the Argentines over the Falkland Islands in the 1980s. So, feminist theory, again, it's an alternative perspective, just the same as constructivism and Marxism and world systems theory that we discussed last chapter. Now, on the state level, we can take a look at the attributes of a specific country or a nation and how that factor in that one country can affect whether or not there's conflict. For example, some people would say that democracies are more peaceful. Some regime types, if we talk about type of government, some regime types are more peaceful than others, that democracies are inherently more peaceful than authoritarian rule. A lot of people would say that might not necessarily be true. They'd point at the United States in the early 2000s and say, well, if the U.S. is a democracy and democracies are more peaceful, explain Afghanistan, explain Iraq. So it's up for debate. And a lot of people would look at that and say, well, look at an authoritarian regime, the people they're keeping down are the people they're fighting against, which is the causes of more civil war. So, again, up for interpretation. The type of economy. Again, we talked about it a second ago with the idea of interdependence. Typically, the more capitalist a country is, the more peaceful they are. The idea of you don't shoot your customers, you don't mess with people who would potentially buy your goods. So the same holds true. demographic, cultural, physical, geographic attributes. The idea that the more complex your relationship is, either within a country or between your country and another, the more complex the relationships, the more likely conflict is. Because all it takes is really one match set to the Kindle, or set to the Tinder. I'll use the right words eventually. One match set to the Tinder sets all the relationships ablaze, all the complexity. That's all it takes, is one flare-up. So the less complex or the less difficult the relationship is, the better for those two countries. The level of political instability within a country. There's an idea called diversionary theory. The idea is, if I'm ruling a country and I have a lot of problems at home, why would I focus on those problems when I can start a war with someone else to get everybody to pay attention to that? Take a look at Iran under Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, under the last presidency in Iran for the last 8 years. He was facing serious economic concerns at home. But in order to try and divert his country's gaze from dealing with these economic issues, which would have ultimately put him out of power, let's face it, he instead said, no, I want to build a nuclear program. I want to get the United States' attention. I want to, start stirring up conflicts with my enemies within the Middle East, Israel, and the like. The idea that he's going to stir those things up so he can ignore his own economy. It's the idea of Wag the Dog. It was a movie in the 1990s and 2000s. It was in the 2000s starring Robert De Niro called Wag the Dog. The idea of an American president causing a war to try and divert attention from a scandal at home. Wouldn't be the first time, wouldn't be the last. A lot of people accused Bill Clinton, while he was in the midst of his impeachment trial, of going to war in Kosovo as a diversionary tactic. Quick, we're at war over here in Kosovo, pay attention to this, ignore this scandal at home. And last, if a country's been in a lot of war lately, there's something called war weariness. The idea that, listen, people have had enough. And a lot of people, for example, after Vietnam, and I think a lot of people in the United States after Afghanistan and Iraq have said, we're done. We're good with conflict right now. We have no stomach for it. As a result, you see countries that are more peaceful, especially after they're coming out of a more severe conflict. Then there are the individual level explanations. And for this, we need to really think about the leaders involved. Because realistically, you and I aren't going to be the ones to cause a global war, but the leaders at the top levels of every single one of these states could. So we have to keep them intact. We've talked about human nature all throughout the course, and the idea that humans are inherently aggressive. No matter what they do, they are inherently aggressive. They will continually seek to fight one another. And as a result, as human nature kind of dictates, it's going to cause people to want to fight. Sometimes we have to take into account the characteristics of leaders, either psychologically or personality-wise. Now, psychologically, the idea that some people may be compensating, that a leader who has either low self-esteem or low approval might be attempting to compensate for that low self-esteem or low approval by picking a fight with a larger country. Wouldn't be the first time, wouldn't be the last. These things happen. Also, personality traits. It really depends a lot on personality. If you have an extrovert versus an introvert, some of these people act out in different ways. Extroverts want to be friends, therefore they're typically more liberal, in terms of international relations theory. So there's a lot of wide open considerations here. The last is the idea of groupthink. Groupthink, for those of you who don't know, is the idea that if, multiple people are in a room, multiple people are a part of a decision, sometimes that forces the decision to a more extreme level. Could be a potential issue. That kind of leads to more conflict, and really depends on the situation. Now let's step back and talk about civil wars. Civil wars typically kind of fall into really two categories. There's the first, which is where you have a group of people who are rising up to overthrow a government that is holding back from them. This is the idea of frustration-aggression theory, that countries will resort to violence, or groups within a country will resort to violence when they're under conditions of persistent denial of an expected treatment, freedom, economic ability, etc. The idea of frustration aggression theory is that eventually I have had enough, I can't take it anymore, we're going to overthrow the government and try and take over what we can because we're so frustrated. The idea of frustration aggression theory is, again, based more in an idea of relative deprivation. And that key word there is relative. Relative always will relate back to how does what I have relate to what you have, relate to what somebody else has, etc. Relative deprivation talks about the discrepancy between what people actually have and what they think they have. And if they think they deserve more and they think they deserve a lot more, that could lead to some difficulties. That's issue number one. Issue number two is the other main pattern in civil war, which is ethnic conflict. Now, it really comes from one of three theories. There's primordialism, which is the idea that fundamental bonds of kinship and identity have been just emphasized for years and years and years, and so you have these ancient hatreds for one another that have just been bubbling up for generations and generations and centuries. The idea that these two groups were always kind of geared to annihilate one another. The second was instrumentalism, which stresses the role of leaders who kind of come to power, say, I don't like these people. Looking at Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis, this is a prime example. The Hutus rise to power, say, those Tutsis are the cause of all our problems, let's eliminate them. This is one person taking charge and trying to overthrow an entire group because of their personal hatred, which they've now turned their whole population against. The last is constructivism, and I know how much fun we have with constructivism in the last chapter. It's the idea that people define their own conflict. So if I define a group of people as being opposed to me, they have to be the enemy. If you even look at what we consider to be a conflict that happens here in, even in Florida, the idea of the Gators versus the Seminoles, which, enough said, they're defined as their enemy, therefore they must be the enemy. Now, in 20 years, for all we know, one of those two teams might stink, and now you have, it's just the Seminoles versus the Hurricanes, or the Gators versus the Hurricanes, or versus UCF, which, who knows? The idea of this, and that's obviously an example on a very, very small, insignificant scale when we're talking about college football versus actual civil war involving ethnic conflict. The idea that people define their conflict. So if they define a group as being opposed, they must be the enemy. Hutus defining Tutsis as their enemy. Therefore, they must be the enemy. Where 20 years later now, if you look at Rwanda, you have these two groups living side by side in peace. Constructivism might be the key. The idea of people see conflict the way they see conflict. Ultimately, as we kind of wrap this chapter up, how does war affect societies? Every generation has been affected or touched by a war. In this country, you can talk about the Afghanistan and Iraq wars affecting this generation, the Vietnam Wars, the generation before, Korea, World War II, World War I. You go all the way back. Every generation of Americans has been defined by one great war. So what will the impact of these be on the children's generation, and what will the next war be? We'll talk next chapter about how we try and keep conflict at bay, and how both liberals and realists will look at international security as a way of trying to solve conflict. That's all for Chapter 5. Remember, the test is coming up. Look forward to seeing you later.